Chapter 1. Slow down, child, I can't keep up, the elderly woman said to a young girl carrying a rose in a small family cemetery. Come on, Grandma, we're almost there, the young girl said as she ran between the headstones. Well, Mom, she's excited about placing the rose on her great-aunt Emily's grave, a younger woman said, walking with her arm linked with the older woman. I know, Catherine, the older woman said. She just has to realize I'm not as young as I used to be. Carrying the rose to great-aunt Emily's grave on her birthday was a family tradition. You were that way, Catherine, when me and your grandmother used to come with you to put the rose on Emily's grave. I think I always looked forward to the cake we always had after I put the rose on her grave, Catherine said. But Emily loves doing this because she wants to share the rose with the girl she was named after. Well, Emily Wyndham was a special girl, the older woman said. I wouldn't be here, and neither would you without her. I know, Catherine said. It was because of Grandma's love for her, she adopted you. Yes, the older woman said. I never really understood that love until I adopted you. What took you so long? The impatient girl said as the two women arrived at the grave. Your grandma's old, she doesn't move as fast as you, Catherine laughed. Can we wish Aunt Emily a happy birthday now? The young girl said. Yes, we can, sweetie, the older woman said. After that, we can get some cake in the parlor. The trip to the grave always began with a happy birthday. Little Emily always liked singing to her. It always ended with Grandma leaving a small note. Thank you for the life you gave me, love your sister, Claire. Okay, who wants some cake? The older woman asked after the ritual ended. I do, the young girl shouted. See there, Mom, she's still a lot like me, Catherine told her mother. That, she is, the older woman said. The young girl helped bring life to the stately Wyndham Manor. It was a well-kept place. It was the envy of high society people in town. The older woman felt it was her mission in life to keep the manor in good order, worthy of the Wyndham name. She also remembered a time when the manor was not so stately, a time when the place was in disrepair. She couldn't blame the lady of the manor for allowing the home to run down. That woman, a lady she would come to call mother, was heartbroken, dealing with the death of a child. You boys slow down, the red-haired woman said, watching her sons run down the street. Charlie O'Hara! You and Robert come back here, the woman shouted as they were returning home from the market. Charles John O'Hara was the second of 5 boys in the O'Hara clan. He was 12, a little more responsible than most boys. He helped his mother struggle to keep her household together. She sometimes kidded him that he was the daughter she never had. But she also knew he was perhaps stronger than any in the family. He also did a good job keeping her brothers in line, especially Robert, who for 10 was somewhat rambunctious. The woman suddenly saw her 2 boys stopped at the iron fence that served as the border of the neighborhood with Wyndham Manor. What are you 2 looking at? The woman asked. The graveyard, Charlie O'Hara said. Robert believes he saw a ghost. But it was only a woman dressed in black carrying a rose. The young woman stopped and looked with her sons. Who is she? Why does she look so sad? Charlie O'Hara asked his mother. That is Mary Wyndham, his mother answered. She is the richest woman in town. Why is she so sad? I hear her daughter died of the fever in the winter. She was probably about your age, from the talk that I hear. The woman didn't seem to notice the 3 spies looking at her through the iron gates. She placed the rose on the grave and walked back toward the manor. Well, boys, we've got to get home, the woman told her sons. Your father will be home from the mill soon. He'll be wanting supper. Home, that wasn't what Charlie called it. It was more like a crowded apartment. As for his father, Walter O'Hara, he spent more time at the saloon than he did at work or home. When he was home, he made life miserable for Charlie's mother, Maggie. He also picked on Charlie a lot for helping his mother do women's work even though his wife surely needed help around the small few rooms they had. When they returned, well, the place was a mess. Lucas, Charlie's older brother, was in charge. The two youngest boys had the run of the apartment. Get the broom, then come in and help me in the kitchen, his mother told him. Charlie went straight to work. He swept up and helped put things away while Lucas just sat in his chair. Robert, carry Eli and Samuel into our room, Charlie said before walking into the kitchen to find his mother sweating over the stove. She handed him a knife. Help me with these carrots and potatoes, would you, love? She said as they went about preparing the meal. Just then, his father staggered into the room, with liquor smelling from his breath. What meal have you prepared for us tonight, my dear Maggie and little Charlotte? He said. Walter, you're drunk, his wife snapped back. And do not call Charlie Charlotte. You know how that hurts his feelings. And somebody has to help me around here. I don't have a daughter to help me out. How does one escape misery? That was what Charlie thought about his life. His parents came from the old country to have a chance at a better life. Life in Ireland couldn't have been any worse than this, he thought, as he walked the family dog. He was just happy to get away. And walking King George was the only way to do it. King George was a mutt they found one day. His father didn't want them to keep it, but his younger brothers kept begging, so his mother relented. They could barely feed the family, much less a dog. But they kept him anyway. Come back here, King George! Charlie yelled after his dog managed to wrangle out of the rope around his neck. I am in big trouble, he said when the dog ran between the bars and onto the property at Wyndham Manor. The gate leading in was chained shut. Charlie looked at the bars and figured he could squeeze through. It was a tight fit. Now where did that mutt go? Charlie thought as he looked around. He looked behind every bush he could find. Still no sign of King George. Suddenly, he felt a strong hand grab him by the back of his coat. Just what do you think you are doing on this property? The man asked. Charlie froze. He was frightened. I'm trying to find my dog, he stammered. Maybe I should take you to the police, the man said. They'll lock you away for trespassing. Charlie didn't know what he feared most, the police, or the beating he would receive from his father for getting in trouble. Myron, let loose of the boy, a woman shouted. Charlie looked and saw a young woman standing on the porch of the home. It was the same woman he saw dressed in black at the graveyard. Bring him to me, she said. Charlie shook as the man escorted him to the woman. Bring him inside and take him to the parlor, the woman said sternly. I can't believe she'll let someone as dirty and ragged as you sit on her furniture, the man said. Charlie sat down in one of the chairs in the room and waited for the woman to walk in. The room was almost as big as his family's apartment. Why are you on my property, young man? The woman asked. I came to get my dog, Charlie said. He walked between the bars when I equals 20 was walking him. And how did you get through the gate? She asked. They are chained shut. I squeezed through the bars, the boy said. You are pretty skinny, the woman said. I take it they don't feed you very much down at the river. Charlie didn't answer. He didn't want pity. So what is your dog's name? The woman asked. I will have Myron find him. His name is King George, the boy answered. Okay, the woman said. Myron, see if you can find King George. And Marilla, get us some tea. Marilla was the maid. She was amazed that Mrs. Wyndham had taken such an interest in finding the boy's dog. Charlie was amazed the woman asked so many questions about his life. She knew his parents came from Ireland. She asked about the conditions of the apartments down by the river, whether his parents were making it all right. She was amazed to find out that he helped his mother with the chores around the house. Madam, I've found the dog, Myron said after he returned to the parlor. Good, she said. Myron will escort us to your home with the dog. You're coming with me? The boy asked. I need to get out, she said. Marilla was amazed. Mrs. Wyndham had not left the property since her daughter died. Charlie and the dog hopped into the carriage as they rode down the road on the way to what best could be called the slums. Mrs. Wyndham looked Charlie over. He seemed to be a gentle-looking child with black hair. She smiled. How old are you? She asked. I'm 12, ma'am, he said. You don't look big enough to be 12, she said as she noticed his dark eyes and long eyelashes. She knew several women and girls who wished they had eyes such as his. Here we are, Charlie said as they arrived at the apartments. His mother was a bit shocked by the company. Fortunately, his father wasn't there to cause any trouble. So 7 people live here? Mrs. Wyndham asked. Yes, ma'am, Charlie's mother replied. Mrs. Wyndham was shocked to see the clothes that the O'Hara children wore. But she didn't judge. Charlie tells me he helps you around the apartment, she said. Yes, ma'am, he does, his mother replied. Is he very responsible? Mrs. Wyndham asked. Yes, ma'am, he is, Mrs. O'Hara said. I'd like to make a proposal, Mrs. Wyndham said. If Charlie can cook and clean, he might be a good helper for Marilla, she said. I can also teach him to help me with my garden. I will pay him a good wage if you'll let him come each day. Charlie and his mother were shocked by the proposal. Well, I would hate to lose his help around here, his mother said. But we could use the extra money. Mrs. Wyndham offered to pay Charlie more than his father made at the mill. But Charlie, it is up to you, his mother said. Charlie didn't take long to decide. He enjoyed getting away from the river, even if it meant hard work. I'd like to do that, Mom, if it won't be too hard on you, Charlie said. Well, that settles it, Mrs. Wyndham said. I'll send Myron to fetch you each morning at 8. Chapter 2. The sound of the rooster came a little too early for Charlie. He eased between Samuel and Eli on the bed. He tried not to wake them, but he saw little Eli's eyes open. He kissed his brother on the forehead. Go back to sleep, he whispered. He quietly got dressed. He looked over and saw Lucas and Robert. They were sound asleep. He knew the 20 routine. He walked out to the chicken coop, joining his mother as they gathered eggs for breakfast. How are you doing this morning, love? She said. I'm doing fine, Ma, he said as he gathered enough eggs for his basket. Are you excited about going to Wyndham Manor? She asked. Yes, Ma, I am, he said. I can't blame you, his mother said. I know Mrs. Wyndham will work you hard. I do not mind work, Ma, he said. I know that you don't, she said as they walked into the kitchen. Charlie helped his mother cook the eggs and helped get the bread out of the oven. He helped set the table before going into the room to wake his brothers. "There is a Mr. Fancy Pants at the door," he heard his father say as they finished their breakfast. "It must be for you, little Charlotte." Charlie rolled his eyes. His mother chastised his father for picking on his son. "Let me get a look at you," his mother said as Charlie prepared to leave the apartment. "You look fine," she said, giving her son a hug. "Put in a good day's work." "You know I will, Ma," he said, hugging her in return. The Mr. Fancy Pants was Myron, who waited patiently for the young boy to climb into the carriage. "I suppose I could give you a hand," he said as he lifted Charlie into the carriage. "I am still very surprised by this. Madam Wyndham has been very withdrawn. I don't know why she's taken a liking to you." Charlie smiled. He didn't know either. He had no idea what was ahead of him. Maybe Madam Wyndham was a taskmaster. Maybe she was his guardian angel, a way out of the slum life. He was treating it, as his mother told him to, as an adventure. The journey was a short one out of the neighborhood. He could see the other neighborhood children watching him as he rode by in what could be best described as a majestic carriage. He didn't feel as his father described, just as a hired hand. He felt more like royalty. The servants opened the gates to Wyndham Manor as the carriage approached. Charlie paid attention to nearly every detail of the place. It didn't seem quite as majestic as the carriage. There were weeds growing up around the place. The once white paint on the home seemed more of a touch of gray. It looked like a somber place, one of great sadness. Waiting for them as they arrived was Marilla. "Come this way, young lad," she said as she led him into a bedroom that seemed as large as the small place where his family dwelt. Charlie couldn't help but notice the dresses on stands. There were very elegant dolls on the dresser and on tables around the room. But most were covered up. "Madam wants you to put these work clothes on and join her in the garden," Marilla said. Laying on the bed was a pair of trousers and a shirt. There was also a pair of gloves and a straw hat. Marilla slowly closed the door behind her. The work clothes actually seemed nicer than the ones he actually wore. He put them as he was told and was amazed by how well they fit. He then looked at the room before he walked out the door. Like the house, there seemed to be a touch of sadness to it. He imagined there was a time when that wasn't so. There had to have been a princess living in this room, he thought, much like the ones in the fairy tales his mother told him about. "There you are," Marilla said, interrupting his train of thought. "Follow me," she said, leading out of the house into the back of the estate. The yard was grown up, but the actual garden itself seemed more like a jungle. Toiling away was the woman Marilla and Myron called Madam Wyndham. She was dressed in a fashion that didn't seem to go well with a woman of that stature. She wore a dress similar to the ones he'd seen his mother and other women wear down by the river while they worked. "See, Marilla, I told you the clothes would fit him," Mrs. Wyndham said. "Are they comfortable?" she asked Charlie. Cheryl nodded. "Good," Mrs. Wyndham said. "My Emily was about your size. I knew you probably needed some work clothes. My guess is the clothes that you wore here were about all you had. I hope I didn't just embarrass you." Charlie nodded to the affirmative. The clothes he wore that day were the only ones he had. And he was also embarrassed that was the case. "Well, you're lucky," Mrs. Wyndham said. "I bought those clothes for Emily to help me out here. Girls aren't supposed to wear trousers, so it is the only pair she had. I couldn't see you out here wearing one of her work dresses, wearing a bonnet like mine. Charlie laughed and blushed. When I help my mother sometimes outside and it's really hot, she makes me wear a bonnet to protect my head, he said. But I don't have to wear a dress, madam. Mrs. Wyndham smiled. She took a finger and tapped his nose. You're almost too pretty to be a boy, she said. Sometimes I think a dress would suit him better, isn't that right, Marilla? Marilla nodded in agreement. Charlie again blushed. Now, we've got a lot of work to do, Mrs. Wyndham said. She wasn't kidding. One could hardly tell the flowers from the weeds. Charlie spent the better part of the morning helping Mrs. Wyndham clear the overgrown weeds away. He was amazed to see how many flowers still grew amidst all of the chaos. Believe it or not, this was once a very beautiful garden, Mrs. Wyndham said. It was the envy of the town. But after my dear Emily died, I couldn't bear to come out here. Charlie wondered what made her change her mind. He wasn't the only one. Marilla, Myron, and the other servants were also very curious in the change of attitude in the lady of the manor. They were equally intrigued with her interest in Charlie. It is almost as if she is talking to Emily out there, Marilla told Myron as they watched from the porch. It doesn't matter to me, Myron said. As long as she's happy. It's been a long time since we've seen her laughing like she is right now. Most of the servants on the property took note of the laughter coming from the garden. It didn't interrupt the work. Charlie helped Madam as he began calling her helped her pile up the weeds and the brush that they managed to clear. Mrs. Wyndham spent part of the time making fun of Charlie's Irish accent. Each time, she corrected his poor grammar and tried to get him to speak properly. Charlie didn't seem to mind. He suddenly came to a complete stop. What's wrong? Mrs. Wyndham asked. Smack in the middle of the garden was a beautiful fountain, one that could not be seen from outside the fence before they started their labor. Oh my gosh, that is so beautiful, madam, he said. He didn't mean to blurt it out. I think so, too, she said. It was also my Emily's favorite place on the whole property. She used to come here by herself and read her favorite books. Do you read, Charlie? Only the Bible, madam, he said. It is the only book we own. Mrs. Wyndham stooped down and picked a yellow flower. That is something we'll have to change, she said as she took the straw hat off his head. She placed the flower in his head. My dear Charlie, she said. You remind me of this garden, this fountain, and this whole estate. Underneath the dirt, there is so much beauty to uncover. Charlie smiled and blushed. He was somewhat embarrassed. He was really perplexed. We've done enough work for today, she said as she put her arm around Charlie. We'll get you cleaned up, get something to eat, and get you home. Get you home were not the words Charlie wanted to hear. But he knew the day could not last forever. He was surprised by what came next. Getting him cleaned up included a lot more than he was expecting. Getting cleaned up in the O'Hara household meant getting a bucket of water and a sponge and washing off. Marilla, take the tub into Emily's room and draw Charlie a bath, were the words Mrs. Wyndham spoke that caught Charlie by complete surprise. And get Helen to draw mine in my bedroom. No ma'am, I can't do that, were the words Mrs. Wyndham heard coming from Emily's bedroom. Is there a problem in here? She said as she peeked through the door. I told him to give me his clothes and then I will help him get in the tub and bathe him, Marilla said. She can't do that, ma'am, she 9LL me naked. Charlie stammered. Nonsense. Mrs. Wyndham said as she tapped Charlie again on the nose. Give her your clothes. She's seen children naked before. She used to bathe Emily. But Emily was a girl. Charlie protested, but then he complied, wrangling out of the filthy work clothes. Give me the clothes, Marilla, and I will take them to Helen on my way to my bath, Mrs. Wyndham said. She winked at Charlie as Marilla helped him into the tub and then departed from the room. There were no more protests from Charlie. The water was warm. It reminded him of the baths his mother told him about that rich lady's take. There were bubbles. The water smelled like perfume. He didn't seem to mind as Marilla scrubbed every speck of dirt off his skin. He relaxed and didn't want to get out when Marilla picked up a towel off the dresser. Step out, she ordered. He complied and stepped into the towel that she wrapped around him. She then led him and sat him down at a chair in front of a mirror. Shouldn't I be getting dressed? He asked. Just a minute, said Marilla as she pulled a brush from one of the drawers. Got to brush your hair first. Brush my hair? Charlie asked. You don't want me to? Marilla asked. It's something I used to do with Emily. Charlie thought about saying, well, I'm not Emily, but said it's okay. He didn't want to admit it, but he actually enjoyed the pampering. He didn't protest as she helped him into his long johns and his clothes. Don't you look nice? Mrs. Wyndham said as he came down to dinner, which compared to what he normally ate each day was a bountiful feast. Mrs. Wyndham continued to ask him about his home life as they ate. It seemed she wanted to know everything about him. Goodbye, you worked very hard today, she said as he hopped into the carriage. She gave him a bag of coins. He looked inside. It was more wages than old Walter O'Hara would make in a month when he actually worked. His heart sank as the carriage drove closer and closer to the slums he called home. He knew how Cinderella felt after the ball, after the clock struck midnight. Chapter 3 I hope the thunder doesn't wake the boys, Maggie O'Hara said as she lit the candle on the table. I know, Ma, but I like it when it rains, Charlie said. It sounds so soothing when it hits the roof. His mother smiled. Let me look at your handiwork, she said, admiring the socks Charlie was knitting. Charlie loved knitting time. He and Ma would settle down in the family's 2 rockers, both brought from Ireland. Robert, Samuel, and Eli were always sound asleep. Lucas and Pa were working late at the mill. If Pa knew Charlie and his mother still had knitting time, he would be furious. He didn't want any of his sons doing women's work, although he allowed Charlie to help out his mother doing her chores. That's very good, she said. Grandma Sullivan would say you've inherited the family gift. His great-grandma Sullivan had a dress shop in Dublin. Each mother in the family felt like it was her duty to pass down the talent to her daughters. It was that way for generations. I have no daughter, so I'm passing it down to you, his mother said. I want you to pass it down to your own daughter, so the chain will not be broken. Charlie blushed. He loved hearing about family history, especially the women of the family. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt some kind of connection to them. And knitting time was also a time Maggie O'Hara liked to talk about woman things. You are the only one in this family who appreciates such thin G's, she told Charlie. She enjoyed listening to Charlie talk about his first-day adventure at Wyndham Manor. She told him she wished she had a garden like the one he and Mrs. Wyndham worked on. She also told him she was envious of the bath he took. Most women here would kill to have a bath like that, she said. Your father would have been furious to have smelled the perfume you had on. Charlie blushed again. "Ma, am I different?" he asked. "What do you mean?" she said, although she had an idea what was going on in his head. "Well, Pa calls me Little Charlotte because I like to help you with your chores," he said. "I like knitting time, I liked the bath at Madam Wyndham's, and she said I was almost too pretty to be a boy. And I don't know if I really act like a boy." His mother at first didn't know what to say. "Come here," she said. She led him to her bedroom. She pulled a trunk out from underneath the bed. He knew the trunk contained her personal belongings, most of which she brought over from Ireland. His eyes opened wide when she opened it. "Beatrice," he said, pulling a doll out from the trunk. "I thought you threw her away." He hugged her close. Beatrice was his mother's doll. She made the journey across the ocean. Charlie played with the doll when he was little. He loved her. But his father didn't want him to play with it. He ordered his wife to throw the doll away, which was something she could not do. "Are you different?" she said with a smile. "No, I'd say you're special, Charlie John O'Hara. God made you a beautiful child, inside and out. You are my son, sweet boy, but at times, I think of you as my daughter." Charlie was stunned. He didn't quite know what to say. "Are you angry at me for saying that?" she said as she brushed his hair out of his face. He shook his head no. She had never forced him to like women's things, or to do women's work, as his father called it. It was something that seemed natural to him. "I'm glad you don't," she said. "That was the reason I passed the knitting skill down to you. It is the reason that everything in this trunk must be passed on to you." It contained a locket. Her diary that he didn't know she had. It contained jewelry that had been passed down from generations. She put the locket around his neck. In it were portraits of his grandmother and his mother when she was a little girl. "Wear it under your clothes so your father won't see it," she said. "You know how she is." Charlie hugged Beatrice before placing her back in the trunk. His mother smiled when Charlie gave the doll a kiss. "Is something bothering you? You seem a little distracted today?" Mrs. Wyndham asked Charlie while they worked in the garden. "No, ma'am," he said as he hoed the dirt row. He couldn't possibly tell her of his conversation with his mother the night before. But he couldn't get the thoughts out of his head. "What is that beautiful thing hanging from your neck?" she asked, noticing the locket. "It's a locket my ma gave me," he said as she grabbed it to look at the portraits inside. "It's too beautiful to be wearing when we're out here with all of this dirt," she said. "Go take it to Marilla and tell her to put it up for you." "Yes, ma'am," he said as he ran up to the house. "I'll put it on the dresser in Emily's room," she said. "You can put it back on after your bath." "That didn't take you very long," Mrs. Wyndham said after Charlie ran back to return to his work. He enjoyed listening to Mrs. Wyndham's plans for the garden. She talked about constructing a gazebo and hiring a band to play concerts for the community near the fountain. Charlie liked the idea. No one in town really knew what beauty lied within the gates of her state. "Well, I guess we are finished for the day," she said. Charlie was disappointed. They were finishing way too early. He wasn't ready to go back to the slum. "Charlie, take those flowers, will you?" she said. "And follow me." They walked over to the family graveyard. She had him place some of the flowers on her late husband's grave. They placed the rest on Emily's grave. He looked at the dates. His mother was right, she was his age when she died. Emily Wyndham, March 23, 1850 to May 1, 1862. beloved daughter and angel. She must have been very special, ma'am, he said. Mrs. Wyndham smiled. Yes, she was very special to me, she said. Just as I know you are to your mother and to me. To you, he said. He couldn't help but think he had only known her a few days. I think an angel led King George through those gates, she said with a laugh. Because the angel knew you would come. I never thought of it that way, Charlie said. She grabbed his hand as they walked up toward the house. Charlie, what do you want to be when you grow up? She asked him. I dunno, he said. I thought about being a soldier. My Uncle John is in the Irish Brigade fighting against the rebels. You might make a good soldier, she said. Hopefully, the war will be over before you are old enough to join. My pa said I will work at the mill like he and Lucas, he said. But I don't want to do that. But my pa picks on me. He says I'm going to be a dressmaker like my great-grandma Sullivan. And what's wrong with being a dressmaker? She said. They make a lot of money in New York, Boston, or Paris. I dunno, I never thought about it, he said. But my ma says I have the family gift. He went on to explain how he and his ma have their special knitting night. Emily and I had nights like that, too, she said as they entered the house. His bath is drawn, ma'am, Marilla said. Helen has yours drawn, too. I'm glad you're not giving me any trouble this time, Marilla said as Charlie handed her his work clothes. He felt a little chilled as before he hopped into the tub. But once he crawled in, he felt nice and warm. I swear, you got dirty today, Marilla said as she scrubbed his behind his ears. She made sure his neck got a good scrubbing. Then came his arms. He was a bit surprised as she worked on his hands. Those gloves must work pretty good, she said, admiring his hands. Your hands are as delicate as a girl. Charlie blushed again. I didn't embarrass you, did I? She asked. Oh, maybe a little, he said. We'll work on those feet when we get you out of the tub, Marilla said. Charlie was even more embarrassed when Mrs. Wyndham walked into the room wearing a house coat as he crawled out and before Marilla could place a towel around him. I want you to put this on our little urchin, she said, handing Marilla a bottle of lotion. I bought it in Paris, Mrs. Wyndham told Charlie. It's supposed to make your skin feel soft and smooth. We both need it after working in the garden. It also smells good. She then reached into the closet and pulled out a sailor suit. I was wrong when I told you the work pants were the only trousers Emily wore, she told Marilla. I had forgotten about this. Put it on Charlie and have him meet in the parlor. Charlie giggled as Marilla lotioned his body and then put powder on him. Oh no, ma'am, I'm not wearing that, he said as Marilla pulled some of Emily's undergarments out of the closet. He didn't know what it was called, he just saw it once in a catalog. His mother called it rich girls' undergarments. Marilla laughed. Your long johns will look silly under the sailor suit, Marilla said. This will be under the sailor suit, so no one else can see. He stared at himself in the mirror. Lucas and Pa would be really mad at me now, he thought. Marilla also gave him what appeared to be a pair of white stockings. She was right. The undergarment was hidden under the sailor suit. The breeches were a little poofed out, he thought, and came down only to his knees. That's why Marilla gave him the white stockings. She also pulled out a pair of shiny black shoes with buckles and told him to put them on. There, she said. You look like a prince. Charlie felt more like a princess as she walked him to the parlor, where he sat until Mrs. Wyndham finished getting dressed. She walked in looking really fancy. She was carrying a straw hat and a book of poetry. She placed the hat on his head and grabbed his hand. They walked onto the porch and down the walkway to the garden. She handed him the book. Inscribed were the words, "To Claire, with love, Mother." "My grandmother gave this to my Aunt Claire," she said. "We're going to use it to help you learn to read and speak properly." Marilla brought them both lemonade as Charlie struggled to read the poetry to Mrs. Wyndham. Charlie stared at the nice French dress as he was about to get back into his old clothes. He hadn't taken off Emily's undergarments yet. Truth be known, he dreaded putting back on the long johns and his old rags. The door was shut. The temptation was a little hard to resist. Who will know, he thought as he pulled the dress on over the rich girl's undergarments. He stood in front of the mirror. He liked what he saw. It was a very beautiful dress, one his mother had told him about many times that rich girls wore. He didn't notice the door slide open. "Oh my," were the words he heard Mrs. Wyndham say. He was frightened. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't run out of the room, so he ran into the closet and sat down. "I'm so sorry," he cried, tears rolling down his face. "I won't do it again. I know you won't let me come back. Charlie, my darling, open this door," Mrs. Wyndham said. Marilla rushed in, wanting to know what was the matter. They both picked Charlie up and placed him on the bed. Mrs. Wyndham pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the tears from his face. She smiled and hugged him. She tapped her finger on his nose. "Do not apologize," she said, trying to reassure him. "I think it looks very beautiful on you. Unfortunately, you've got to get your clothes back on. It's time to take you home." The carriage ride was a quiet one back home. Charlie was still very embarrassed by what had happened. Mrs. Wyndham tried to reassure him there was nothing wrong, that she wasn't. She rode home with him and held his hand most of the way. "You won't tell anyone?" he asked. "Of course not, darling. Your secret is safe with me," she said.